It was small. Small enough to wrap a newborn twice over and still have cloth to spare. Its edges were stitched in pale blue thread by a woman who had done that kind of careful work all her life, the kind of stitching that said, quietly, that the one wrapped inside it mattered. It came through the cottage door last of everything, tumbling out from beneath a fallen shelf as two estate men kicked the last of the furniture onto the lawn. It drifted, almost unhurried, turning once in the cool morning air before landing at the edge of the pile, close to where the fire had begun to take the splintered wood. No one moved to save it. The footman standing at the base of the stone steps had gone pale beneath his collar, his eyes fixed somewhere above the flames, refusing to look down. The two groundsmen near the garden gate had become as still as the iron posts between them. And the Duke of Ashbourne's head steward, a man who had served Ashbourne Hall for 19 years and witnessed the full range of his master's displeasure in all its many forms, stood at the far edge of the path with both hands clasped behind his back and said nothing at all. Down the cottage steps came Lord Edmund Rycroft, 5th Duke of Ashbourne. He was a tall man with a broad build, dressed in a coat the colour of charcoal, his white cravat knotted without a single fold out of place. His dark hair was swept back from a face cut sharp with jaw and cheekbone, and his eyes, the deep, unreadable grey of a sky before a storm, moved across the scene with the careful precision of someone completing a task they have already decided upon. His stride was even. His shoulders were set. He looked like authority given flesh and boots, like a man who had learned long ago that hesitation was the beginning of loss, and had not hesitated since. He looked like a man punishing something that had refused to yield. And kneeling in the gravel before what remained of the cottage garden, her midnight blue gown gathering ash at the hem, her dark copper hair pinned and curled though several strands had come loose in the morning wind, was Clara Whitcombe. One hand was pressed flat against the cold garden stones. The other held a portrait pressed firmly against her chest. Her grandmother's face, oval-framed in gilt, the expression of a woman who had survived enough of the world to know that grief did not excuse injustice. Clara held it close. She said nothing when another crate came down the steps. She said nothing when her grandmother's medicine ledgers scattered across the yard like fallen leaves, pages opening on remedies for fever and difficult births and wounds that came from causes no estate document would ever name. She said nothing when the fire caught properly and the warmth of it reached her face. She said nothing, and the silence she kept did something to the watching men that his commanding voice never quite managed. It made them feel ashamed. Edmund stopped 2 paces from her. He looked down, and for the first time that morning, he received something he had not prepared for, not defiance, not pleading, not the angry words of a woman defending what was hers. He received stillness. Her jaw was tight. Her back was straight. Her eyes did not rise to meet his. She looked only at the portrait in her arms, as though she had already decided that this morning would take nothing more from her than it had taken. He said nothing either. He turned. He walked back to his horse with the same measured stride he had arrived with, coat moving behind him, boots finding the gravel without a sound out of place. He mounted without looking back. He gave a short instruction to the man nearest the gate. Then he rode away from Bellwether Moor, and the smoke rose above the thatched roof, and Clara Whitcombe knelt in the ashes of everything she had ever owned, and held her grandmother's face against her heart. He did not yet know, not then, not on that cold and smoke-stained morning, that the woman kneeling in the wreckage behind him had, 7 weeks before, kept 2 lives from slipping away on a stormy night so severe that the physicians would later admit, with great discomfort and considerable quietness, that they could not have done the same. He did not yet know that his son, tiny, fragile, the only heir Ashbourne Hall had produced after 5 years of marriage, 3 losses, and grief deep enough to change the shape of a man, had drawn his very first breath inside this cottage, beneath this roof, in these hands. He would know. Before the week ended, he would know all of it. And nothing that came after would be simple. Greetings, noble viewers, and welcome to Forbidden Palace. I trust this day finds you well and in excellent spirits. We are drawing closer to the remarkable milestone of 1,000 subscribers, a goal that belongs not only to this channel, but to every one of you who has chosen to remain. If tales of hidden truths, shattered pride, and love rebuilt from the ground up stir something within you, then I humbly ask this: subscribe, leave a like upon this video, and join us as part of this growing circle. And before we continue, tell us in the comments where you are watching from. Name your city, your country, the hour on your clock. I read every single one, and I will be looking for you. Every subscription matters. Every like carries weight. Every comment reminds us why these stories must be told. Now, without further delay, let us return to Clara, to the ashes, and to the truth that is already beginning to find its way home. Before the fire, there was the cottage. It sat at the edge of Bellwether Moor, a short walk from the village of Ashmore, with a thatched roof the sparrows had claimed as their own and a herb garden along the south wall that changed color with every season, pale green in spring, deep silver in summer, bare and skeletal come winter, though even then the dried lavender hung from the rafters and made the whole place smell of something kind. Clara Whitcombe had grown up inside those walls. She had learned to read by lamplight at the kitchen table while her grandmother, Agnes Whitcombe, catalogued remedies in the margins of worn ledgers. She had learned to mix a poultice at 7, to stitch a wound at 12, and to deliver a child at 19, the midwife's apprentice who became the midwife, because the midwife grew old and there was no one else in Ashmore willing to be woken at 3 in the morning for the work. The village trusted her. Not with the easy trust they gave shopkeepers or the parish vicar, but the deeper kind, the kind earned in the hours before dawn, in rooms where fear had already arrived and someone steady was needed to meet it. When a fever would not break, they sent for Clara. When a birth ran difficult, they sent for Clara. When there was no coin to pay a physician and shame kept a woman from the workhouse doctor, they sent for Clara. She never turned anyone away. She asked only that people be honest with her, about symptoms, about how long they had waited, about what they had already tried. She did not ask about station or income. She did not ask for gratitude. She made her grandmother's tea, she rolled up her sleeves, and she worked. The cottage was her inheritance. Not in gold, Agnes had never had gold, but in the legal sense. A deed, dated 32 years prior, signed by the previous county land registrar, sat inside a battered tin box beneath the kitchen floorboards. Clara knew it was there. Agnes had told her precisely where it was, the same way she had told her where the foxglove was stored, calmly, plainly, because both pieces of information were simply necessary. The land the cottage sat upon, however, was another matter. And that was where the trouble had begun. 3 months before the fire, a notice had arrived from Ashbourne Hall, signed not by the Duke himself but by his steward, Mr. Oswin Vale. It was neatly written, formally polished, and explained, with the precision of a man who had practiced the explanation, that the ground beneath Clara's cottage had been determined to lie within the boundary of the Ashbourne estate. It invited her, with considerable courtesy, to vacate within 30 days. Clara had read it twice. Then she had set it on the kitchen table, brewed herself a cup of rosehip tea, and sent a letter to the county records office requesting a copy of every boundary survey conducted within 5 miles of Bellwether Moor in the last 40 years. She had also sent a rather shorter letter to Ashbourne Hall. It said, in its entirety, "The deed is valid, the land is mine, and I will not be leaving. With the customary regards, Clara A. Whitcombe." In the village, this was discussed with a mixture of admiration and quiet terror. Mabel Trent, who ran the wool shop, told her daughter it was the bravest letter written in Ashmore in living memory. Old Percy at the farrier's said it was also likely the last letter Clara Whitcombe would ever need to send, if the Duke was in the mood she'd heard he was in since losing his wife. Both of them were, in their different ways, correct. Edmund Rycroft had not always been this particular kind of man. Those who had known him before the marriage, before the losses, before Lady Beatrice, before grief settled into him the way damp settles into old stone walls and refuses to leave, remembered a younger Edmund who had laughed at dinners and argued with genuine heat about land reform and the price of grain and whether the northern counties were being fairly represented in Parliament. He had married Beatrice Aldworth in the autumn of his 28th year. She was gentle, quietly funny, and loved him in a manner that did not perform itself for an audience. She had also been fragile in the way some people are fragile, not weak, not frail, but built from something finer than the world tends to accommodate, and the world had not accommodated her. 3 pregnancies had ended in grief. The 4th had ended differently, though its beginning had frightened everyone who knew what the previous 3 had cost. Henry had survived. Small, pale-haired, solemn in the way of a child who had arrived knowing something about the effort of arriving. Beatrice had recovered from the birth, or so it had appeared, until the fever came 6 weeks later, settling in her lungs with quiet, terrible patience. Edmund had sat at her bedside for 11 days. On the 12th morning, he had gone to have his boots changed and she had slipped away between one breath and the next, as though she had waited for a moment when he was not watching so as not to distress him. He had not recovered from that. He had done the visible things, continued to manage the estate, continued to attend the necessary dinners, continued to present himself as a man whose affairs were in order. But something had shifted behind his eyes, and those who looked closely enough saw that the man who had argued with warmth about grain prices no longer argued about anything. He simply decided, and moved forward, and did not look back. Into this particular state of a man came Oswin Vale, who had been steward at Ashbourne Hall for 11 years and had spent those years learning, with considerable skill, how to make himself indispensable. Vale was thin and neatly assembled, with careful hands and a habit of presenting problems in a way that made his preferred solution appear to be the only rational one. He was not a man who lied outright. He was a man who selected, arranged, and framed. Who knew which information to put forward and which to set aside, and who had refined this skill into something that could pass, in most circumstances, for expertise. He had come to Edmund with a story about boundary documents. About records that suggested Clara Whitcombe's cottage sat on land that had legally reverted to the Ashbourne estate 2 decades prior. About a woman who was holding those contested records hostage in her home, whether by knowledge or accident he could not say. Edmund had asked 3 questions. Vale had answered all 3 with the calm of a man who has prepared for them. The 4th question, the one that would have changed everything, Edmund had not thought to ask. He had not asked, "Why does the land matter so much?" The answer, had he known to seek it, would have rewritten everything that followed. They met for the first time, properly, face to face, with no servants as shields, 10 days before the fire, when Edmund rode out to Bellwether Moor to assess, as Vale had put it, the situation firsthand. He had expected argument. He had possibly expected tears. He had not expected to find her in the garden on her knees with her sleeves already rolled to the elbow, her hands deep in the late autumn soil, pressing bulbs into the earth with the matter-of-fact precision of someone who intends to be here next spring. He dismounted and stood at the garden gate for a moment. She did not look up. He cleared his throat. "Miss Whitcombe." "I know who you are," she said, without lifting her head. "I will finish this row before we speak. The bulbs will not wait for a dukedom." He had not, in recent memory, been made to wait for a row of bulbs. He found he had no immediate answer. She finished the row. She sat back on her heels, stripped off her garden gloves, and looked up at him for the first time. Her eyes were a warm, direct brown, the kind that did not look away to be polite. There was soil along her forearm and a smear of something green on her chin. She appeared entirely unconcerned about both. "Your Grace," she said then, her voice even. "You've sent 3 notices. I've replied to each. My position has not changed." "Your position," he said, "is legally unsupported." "The survey." "The survey Mr. Vale commissioned," she said, standing, from a surveyor Vale himself employed, "is a document that contradicts the county record by 14 feet and 62 years. I have requested the original registration from the Land Office in Exeter. It arrives within the fortnight." He looked at her steadily. Something moved behind his expression, not quite irritation, not quite respect, something that had no clean name. "You are aware," he said quietly, "that I have considerable resources available to dispute this." "I am aware," she replied, "that you do. I am also aware that being right is not the same as being powerful, and that in this county, only one of those things tends to matter." She looked at him without flinching. "I am choosing to believe, for now, that you are not the kind of man who uses power in place of evidence. I may be wrong. I suppose we will find out." He left without another word. He rode back to Ashbourne Hall with the strange and unwelcome feeling that he had just lost an argument he had not technically participated in. He told Vale that the matter would be resolved within the week. Vale told him the woman was a nuisance and likely in possession of papers she had no right to. He offered to handle the rest. Edmund said yes. He was already thinking about something else. Or trying to. 7 weeks earlier. Before any of this, before the notices, before the riding out to the moor, before the growing coldness between Ashbourne Hall and the village, there had been a storm. It came in from the north in the middle of October, the kind that the older moorland folk could read in the clouds 3 hours before it arrived and that the county newspapers would describe afterward as exceptional. Rain came in sheets. The single road connecting Ashmore to the main coaching route flooded in 4 places within an hour. Trees came down. The river at the edge of the Ashbourne parkland rose well past its bank. Lady Beatrice Rycroft had gone that afternoon to visit her sister in Whitstone, against the advice of her physician, who worried she was further along than the journey warranted. The birth was not expected for another 4 weeks. The carriage had set off before the weather turned and was caught on the moor road when the storm hit without warning. The carriage wheel went into a flooded rut 3 miles from Ashmore. The axle cracked. The coachman could not ride for help because the horses had already been freed from the traces to keep them from injuring themselves in the water. There was no shelter within sight. Only the moorland grass, the rain, and, some quarter-mile distant, a light in the window of a small thatched cottage at the edge of the heather. Clara had been awake. She had been cataloguing seeds by lamplight, listening to the rain increase, when she heard the pounding on her door, not the urgent knock of a familiar neighbour, but the flat, desperate striking of someone who had no more time for courtesy. She opened the door and found the Duchess of Ashbourne's lady's maid, soaked through, her face stripped of all composure, saying only, "Please. She's in the carriage. The baby is coming and it's too fast. Please." Clara had her bag in her hand before the sentence was finished. The carriage was worse than she had been told. Beatrice was in the deep, quiet panic of a woman who has been frightened before and is now working only to keep fear from overtaking her entirely. She was pale in the way that said things were moving very quickly, and the child, for weeks early, was not inclined to wait. Clara worked by the light of a single lantern in conditions that made every standard she had been trained to worse than inadequate. The maid held the light. The coachman stood in the rain outside and was not asked to do anything except stay close enough to hear if he was needed. It took 3 hours. There were moments Clara did not allow herself to think about afterward, not because they had ended badly, but because thinking about how close things had come was a particular kind of exhaustion she could not afford to carry. She simply did what was in front of her. When Henry Rycroft came into the world, he was small and pale and indignant about everything, and the sound he made was the most welcome sound Clara had heard in her professional life. Beatrice, exhausted and shaking and weeping with relief, had taken Clara's hand in both of hers. "Tell me your name," she whispered. "Please. I want to know your name." "Clara Whitcombe. I live not far. The cottage with the lavender." Beatrice had closed her eyes. Then she had opened them again, and something in her expression asked something her voice would not, quite, say aloud. "My husband," Beatrice said quietly. "He is a private man. And this, the manner of it, he would not want it spoken of outside this circle. He is proud in the way good men sometimes are, and pride and gratitude are very difficult together." She paused. "Would you allow us to keep this quiet? I will see you are thanked properly. Only quietly." Clara had looked at the child, wrapped now in the pale blue blanket that had been packed in Beatrice's travelling case, stitched at the edges by Beatrice's own hand in the months of preparation. "I require nothing," Clara had said. "Only that you keep warm and rest before moving. I'll sit with you until the weather settles enough to send for help." She had sat until nearly 4 in the morning, when riders from Ashbourne Hall finally arrived, alerted by the coachman who had walked 3 miles through the flooding to reach them. She had walked home as the rain began to ease, her clothes soaked, her bag heavier than it had been. She had told no one. not even when the notices began to arrive. Vale had not, in fact, simply set the fire. The way it happened, and the way it would be described afterward in the inquiry, and the way Edmund would turn it over in his mind for a very long time, was more careless than malicious, and that somehow made it harder to account for. The men Vale had sent arrived at the cottage at first light. Clara had refused to open the door at first, had stood behind it and told them, in a clear and steady voice, that she had a right to remain on this property and would not be removing herself or her belongings without a court order. Vale's man had told her the order would be obtained in due course and that the Duke wished the matter concluded today. A second man had begun moving items from the garden shed to the lane. A third had found the cottage door unlocked at the back. By the time Edmund arrived, called directly by Vale, who presented it as a matter requiring his personal authority, the men were already inside. Edmund had not asked, on the ride out, what had already been done. He had assumed, from Vale's manner, that this was an eviction of property and papers, not an eviction of a woman from her home on a cold morning with a fire already lit inside. The fire was an accident, technically. A lantern, kicked in the press of men moving furniture, caught the edge of Clara's medicine cabinet, where dried herbs in linen pouches made excellent kindling. By the time anyone understood what was happening, the cabinet was gone and the wall behind it was taking the heat. Vale's man had told Edmund there was nothing to save, and that the fire was small and would not spread. He had not mentioned that the woman was still in the front garden collecting what she could carry. Edmund had looked at her kneeling in the gravel, holding her grandmother's portrait, and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that did not already sound hollow. He had turned away. He had ridden back to the hall, and the guilt that followed him was the kind he did not know how to name because he had told himself, the whole way out, that he was doing something legal and necessary and correct, and he was no longer certain any of that was true. By midday, the cottage roof had partially fallen in. By afternoon, the village knew. Mabel Trent at the wool shop did not speak to any Ashbourne servant who entered for the next 3 days. Old Percy told the ostler from the hall that if the Duke wanted his carriage horse rested, he could find himself another farrier. The physician, Dr. Hargreaves, who had always depended on Ashbourne patronage for a significant part of his practice, was seen leaving the village in the direction of the moor with a blanket and a basket of food. The village, which had no power over the Duke, expressed its feelings in the only currency available to it: silence, and the turning of backs. Clara, for her part, was staying in the small room above Mabel's shop. She had not wept, as far as anyone had seen. She had eaten supper, thanked Mabel in 3 words, and asked to borrow paper and ink. She wrote 1 letter. It was not to Edmund. It was to the Land Records Office in Exeter, asking them to expedite the original survey document she had requested. Then she went to sleep. Henry Rycroft was 3 years old, and he had his father's stubborn jaw and his mother's enormous, watchful eyes, and he was, by the assessment of every person at Ashbourne Hall who cared for him, a child of unusual gravity for his age. He did not speak many words yet, and the physician had noted this without alarm, saying that some children held their words longer than others and that the ones who did often spoke with more precision when they finally arrived. What Henry lacked in speech he made up in observation. He noticed things. He sat very still in corners and watched the adults around him with those wide grey eyes, and the nursery maids had developed the habit, without quite deciding to, of behaving slightly better than they might otherwise when he was in the room. Edmund brought him to the village 4 days after the fire. It was not a deliberate choice. He had business at the post house, and the nursery maid had taken ill, and Henry had made it clear, with considerable quiet insistence, that he was coming with his father and that was simply how things were. They were passing the wool shop when Henry, riding on his father's arm, went very still. Then he pointed. Clara was crossing the lane. She was carrying a bundle of dried rosemary from somewhere, Mabel's garden, probably. And her hair was down loose, which it almost never was in the village, and she was looking at the ground and not at them. Henry said, very clearly, a single syllable. Lane. And then, when she did not hear, he said it again, louder, reaching both arms toward her. Lane, lane, lane. Edmund stopped walking. What is it? Henry was still reaching. His whole small body had oriented toward her with the unambiguous direction of a compass. Clara heard. She turned. And the expression that crossed her face, just for a moment, before she smoothed it, was not the expression of a stranger. It was the expression of someone who knows a child, and is trying to decide whether they are allowed to show it. She recovered quickly. She gave Henry a small, neutral smile. She nodded once to Edmund, not a bow, not a courtesy, simply an acknowledgement that he existed in the world, and she turned and walked on. Edmund stood in the lane with his son still reaching for her retreating figure. Henry. His voice was careful. Do you know that woman? Henry looked at him with those enormous eyes. Then he turned back to where Clara had been, and his bottom lip pushed out, and he said, with the particular grief of a 3-year-old being denied something they cannot explain. Lane. That evening, Edmund went to the nursery and stood for a long time looking at the shelf where Henry's things were arranged with the orderly care of a woman who loved the child in it. There was a wooden horse, a soft rabbit with one ear repaired in darker thread, a set of painted alphabet blocks. Unfolded on the lower shelf, put away as though stored deliberately, was a small pale blue blanket with stitching at the edges. He picked it up. He looked at the pale blue stitching for a long time. Then he sat down, very slowly, in the chair beside the shelf, and he began to think. The portrait had not burned. Clara had held it against her chest the entire morning, walked with it back to Mabel's shop, and propped it against the wall of the borrowed room with the care of someone relocating a library to a smaller building, that particular combination of urgency and reverence. Agnes Whitcombe looked out from the frame with the expression that had never changed in all the years Clara had known it. Steady. Composed. A woman who has outlived several things the world tried to use to defeat her and is therefore somewhat difficult to surprise. On the third night, unable to sleep, Clara lit the stub of a candle and sat looking at her grandmother, and it occurred to her, for no reason she could later explain, only that grief has a way of directing attention toward the things it once found, that the frame was heavier than it should be. She turned it over. The backing paper had been affixed with small, careful stitches, the same kind Agnes had used in her ledger bindings. And behind it, pressed flat and folded into thirds, was a letter. It was dated 22 years ago. It was addressed to Agnes from a man named Clement Foss, who had worked as the county land surveyor for 14 years before his retirement, and it said, with the directness of a man putting guilt into writing before he died, which Foss had apparently known he was about to do, that the 1863 Ashbourne estate boundary survey had been conducted incorrectly, not by accident, but by instruction. The instruction had come from Oswin Vale's uncle, who had been steward at Ashbourne Hall at that time, and who had needed a particular stretch of moorland to disappear from the public record in order to conceal a debt he had promised the estate and never paid. He had expanded the survey boundary by 90 feet in the direction of Bellwether Moor. 90 feet that, on paper, consumed 3 small tenancy properties and the ground beneath them. The ground beneath Clara's cottage. Foss had written to Agnes because Agnes had been the one person in the village he thought would know what to do with the truth, and because he could not take it to a magistrate without destroying his own reputation alongside the Vales, and because a dying man, it turns out, has more need of honesty than of reputation. Agnes, apparently, had done nothing with the letter. Or perhaps she had simply kept it, understanding that truths, like bulbs, are sometimes better pressed into the ground and left to wait for the right season. Clara read the letter 3 times. Then she folded it very carefully, pressed it flat, and placed it inside her grandmother's medicine ledger, the one she had rescued from the garden, which she then put at the bottom of the bag beneath her cot. She was still deciding how to use it when Lady Honoria Blackwell arrived in Ashmore. Honoria Blackwell was the only daughter of Lord Blackwell of Stourton, possessed of a very handsome income, a very sharp tongue, and a conviction, developed gradually over the 2 years since Beatrice's death, that she was the natural and obvious next Duchess of Ashbourne. She arrived in the village with a carriage, a maid, and a story. The story was that Clara Whitcombe had a history of inserting herself into the affairs of great houses. That she had attended the birth of Lady Fellow's child without being properly summoned and had made claims about the condition of the infant that no qualified physician would support. That she was, in short, precisely the kind of woman who attached herself to wealthy families in difficult moments and then made use of that attachment. It was a story assembled from almost nothing, 3 pieces of genuine village gossip stitched together with invention, and Honoria delivered it at dinner tables across the county with the confidence of a woman who has found that confidence alone will carry a story a remarkable distance before anyone thinks to verify it. Within 4 days, people who had never met Clara Whitcombe were expressing concern about her character. Edmund heard it. He said nothing, which Honoria took as agreement. It was not agreement. It was the silence of a man sitting with something he could not yet name, turning a pale blue blanket over in his hands and trying to remember everything that had happened in October and what he had never thought to ask. It was Edmund himself who called the inquiry. He had not told Vale he was going to do it. He had sent the notices himself, to the county magistrate, to the land office, to Dr. Hargreaves, and to 3 of the village's senior residents whose names he had learned, quietly, over the course of 2 weeks of careful listening. He had also, through channels he did not explain to anyone in the hall, sent a note to Clara Whitcombe. It said, "I am holding an inquiry at Ashbourne Hall on Saturday next. I am requesting your presence. You are not obligated to attend. I hope that you will." He had signed it with his full title and then, underneath, in plainer hand, simply, Edmund. Clara had read the note in Mabel's back room. Mabel had asked, from the doorway, what it said. Clara had said it was an invitation. "Are you going?" Mabel asked. "I'm considering," Clara said. "It's a trap," said Mabel, who had strong opinions and was not shy about them. "He'll have lawyers. He'll have documents. He'll have Vale." "I have a letter," Clara said. She went. She arrived at Ashbourne Hall on the Saturday in a gown she had borrowed from Dr. Hargreaves' wife, dark green wool, well made, nothing remarkable, but clean and properly fitted, which was its own kind of statement. She had pinned her hair. She had not borrowed jewelry. She carried her grandmother's ledger under one arm and the folded letter tucked inside it, and she walked through the great doors of Ashbourne Hall with the bearing of someone who had been invited and intended to say what she had come to say. The room was fuller than she had expected. Edmund stood at the head of the long table, not seated, standing. Around the table, the county magistrate, 2 of his assistants, Dr. Hargreaves, 3 village residents she recognized, and with the expression of a man who has been told nothing troubling is about to happen, Oswin Vale. In the corner, in a straight-backed chair, was Bess Fenwick. Clara recognized her as one of the maids from the carriage party on the October night. She had wondered, since, what Bess had made of it all. Honoria Blackwell was also present, seated at the far end, wearing wine-dark silk and the composed expression of a woman who has already written the conclusion of this scene in her head. Edmund's eyes found Clara when she entered. He held her gaze for a moment, not long, not theatrically. And then he directed his attention to the magistrate and said, plainly, "I have called this inquiry because I believe a serious error has been made. I do not yet know the full shape of it. I am asking everyone present to speak honestly and to allow the truth to correct the record, regardless of where it falls." Vale shifted slightly in his seat. It was the kind of shift that, in a less careful man, would have been a flinch. Vale spoke first. He spoke with the practiced ease of a man who has rehearsed, his account smooth and consistent, the boundary dispute, the legal notices, the woman's refusal to comply with a legitimate estate requirement, the unfortunate accident with the fire. He was sympathetic about the fire. He hoped the woman had found adequate shelter. He expressed, with measured concern, his worry that documents held within the cottage may have included items of private estate importance. Edmund let him finish. Then he said, quietly, "Miss Whitcombe. Your turn, if you please." Clara placed her grandmother's ledger on the table. She placed the folded letter beside it. She did not look at Vale. She looked at the magistrate. She spoke clearly, and without decoration, about what the letter said: Foss's confession, the 1863 survey, the deliberate repositioning of the boundary, the name of the man who had given the instruction. She spoke about what the instruction had been designed to conceal. And she set the letter on the table in front of the magistrate and stepped back. Vale's composure developed, for the first time, a visible crack. "That letter," he said, with only the faintest alteration in his tone, "is a fabrication. The woman has a motive too." "The letter," said the magistrate, picking it up, "is dated 1872, and this is Clement Foss's handwriting. I knew Foss. I have documents of his in my own office." He set it down. "I will be having it verified, but I want to be very clear, Mr. Vale, that I will need considerably more than your assertion to doubt it." The room was quiet. It was into this quiet that Bess Fenwick stood up. She was small and her hands were twisted together in front of her, and she had the look of a woman who has been afraid for a long time and has decided that being afraid is simply not a sufficient reason to stay silent any longer. "I need to say something," she said. "About the October night." Edmund turned to look at her. Bess told it plainly. The carriage, the storm, the road, the flooding, the long quarter-mile across the moor, the door that had opened before she had finished knocking. She told it with the honest, unpolished detail of someone reporting what she had seen rather than what she had planned to say. She said that Miss Whitcombe had not hesitated for a single moment. She said that the Duchess had been in very serious difficulty by the time they arrived. She said that she was not a physician and could not use the words physicians used, but that she believed, and had believed every day since, that without Miss Whitcombe, neither the Duchess nor Master Henry would have survived the night. The room absorbed this in stages. Edmund did not move. His face had changed in the way faces change when something too large to immediately feel arrives all at once, not grief, not anger, not relief. All three of them arriving at the same moment and none of them quite able to pass through first. Henry, who had been brought to the hall by the nursery maid and was waiting in the corridor outside, because Henry had once again made it quietly, irrefutably clear that he was going where his father was going, had apparently been listening through the partially open door. He pushed it the rest of the way open and walked in on small, determined legs. He crossed the room. He crossed it with complete certainty, as though he had always known exactly where he was going, and he stopped in front of Clara, and he held up both arms. "La," he said. Clara looked down at him. And then, for the first time since the fire, the thing she had been holding very carefully behind a straight spine and a steady jaw came loose, just a little, at the edges, and her eyes filled. She knelt and picked him up, and he put both arms around her neck with the absolute confidence of a child who knows, in the unargued way children know things, that they are exactly where they are supposed to be. Edmund watched his son in the arms of the woman he had wronged, and he understood, with complete and devastating clarity, everything he had done. Honoria, at the far end of the table, opened her mouth. The magistrate looked at her, and something in his expression was enough. She closed it again. Edmund walked the length of the room and stopped in front of Clara. Henry, from her arms, watched his father with the grave, expectant attention of a child at a very important moment. Edmund spoke quietly. Not to the room. To her. "I don't know how to make this right," he said. "I know that saying so is not enough. I know that it is, in fact, embarrassingly insufficient. But I have no other place to begin." "No," Clara agreed. Her voice was level. "You don't." She looked at him with those direct brown eyes. "But beginning is at least something." Oswin Vale was arrested before the month ended. The fraud uncovered by Foss's letter extended, as fraud tends to do when examined honestly, considerably further than anyone had initially suspected. The 1863 boundary manipulation had concealed a debt originally owed to the estate by Vale's uncle, but that debt had been paid, quietly and in full, by 3 village tenants in the form of land taken from them without legal process. 2 of those properties had since been absorbed into the Ashbourne estate and rented back to other tenants, generating income that had, for 2 decades, flowed to Vale personally under a false account designation. The estate solicitors, once handed Foss's letter and instructed by Edmund to find everything, found rather a lot. Vale, at his hearing, attempted the same composure he had presented at the inquiry. It lasted approximately until the 3rd document was read aloud, at which point composure gave way to something more technical and legal in nature. The magistrate accepted his reduced statement without warmth. He was removed from his position, tried the following spring, and ordered to make full restitution to the families affected, a process that would, given the figures involved, occupy him for the remainder of his natural life. Lady Honoria's campaign against Clara's reputation did not survive the inquiry's conclusions. In the weeks that followed, the county had a great deal to say, and none of it concerned Clara's character in the unflattering direction Honoria had promoted. What was discussed instead, at dinner tables and in drawing rooms across 3 parishes, was the matter of a woman who had saved the Duke's heir on a flooded moor in October and then stood in the wreckage of her own home without ever once using that fact as a weapon. Honoria departed Ashmore in her carriage on a Tuesday morning, having declined every social invitation for a fortnight. The doors that had been opened to her, not slammed, merely unlatched with a particular slowness, began, one by one, to find themselves occupied by other arrangements whenever she called. It was the most English form of consequence, invisible to the eye, completely understood by everyone. She went to stay with her sister in Bath and did not return. Clara's cottage was rebuilt. Edmund had asked her, directly, in the week after the inquiry, what she wanted done. He had not made assumptions. He had not sent men with plans. He had arrived at Mabel Trent's shop on a Wednesday afternoon, on foot, not on horseback, and stood in the doorway with his hat in his hands in the way of a man who no longer felt entitled to make himself at home anywhere, and he had asked, "What would you want, if you were allowed to have exactly what you want?" Clara had considered this for a moment, and then she had told him. The cottage was rebuilt on the same foundations, but larger, 2 rooms added to the eastern side, with a proper dispensary room on the ground floor and a small chamber above it for women who needed somewhere to rest before or after difficult circumstances. A solid hearth. A door wide enough for a cot to pass through. A path laid with flat stones from the moor so the lane would not flood in the winter. Along the south wall, where the herbs had been, the garden was replanted. Clara did most of it herself, on her knees in the soil in her working apron, and if Edmund appeared on several of those mornings with a wheelbarrow and no explanation, she did not ask him to leave. He worked quietly. He was, she noticed, good with his hands, not in the way of a man making a point, but in the simple way of someone who finds physical work steady and clarifying. He did not try to talk his way back into anything. He showed up, and he worked, and when she handed him the rosemary and told him it went there, against the warm stone wall, he planted it there. On an afternoon in March, when the garden was beginning to show the pale green of new growth and the air had the particular quality of a season turning, Edmund sat back on his heels and looked at the lavender shoots they had just pressed in along the path. "I owe you more than a garden," he said. "You do," she agreed, without sentiment. "And a garden is a reasonable place to start." She pressed one more plant into the earth and patted the soil around it. "Don't think this is easy, by the way. Forgiving someone who burned your home requires significant tea consumption, and I have been through Mabel's entire supply twice over." He was quiet for a moment. Then, quietly, "Your Grace," she said, in a different tone, "I have heard dying goats make cleaner confessions." He looked at her. She was already looking at the lavender. But the corner of her mouth had lifted. He laughed, then. Not loudly, it arrived quietly, the way something returns after a long absence, and it changed his face into something she had not seen before. Something younger, and less defended, and considerably more interesting. She noticed. He noticed that she noticed. Neither of them said anything about it. But Henry, sitting on the garden wall with his wooden horse, watched the 2 of them with his large, thoughtful eyes, and appeared, for a child of 3, to find the situation entirely satisfactory. Spring, 1 month later. There were 3 moments, before it became undeniable, that Clara catalogued privately with the careful attention she gave to symptoms. The first was the evening Edmund brought Henry to the new dispensary on the excuse of a cough that Clara assessed, in approximately 40 seconds, to be entirely fictional. Henry himself appeared to know the cough was fictional and watched his father with the expression of a child who has been recruited into something without being fully consulted. Edmund had stayed 2 hours. They had talked about the village, about Agnes's ledgers, about the history of the Foss family, about the Northern Land Reform Bill, about a great many things that had nothing to do with a cough. When he left, he paused in the doorway and looked at her for a moment, just a moment, and said nothing, and then left. The second was the letter. It arrived folded and without a seal, delivered by hand, by a young groom who also delivered, separately, a rather fine bunch of early spring primroses, in a manner the groom had clearly been instructed to present as entirely unconnected. The letter said, in Edmund's handwriting, "I have been thinking about a conversation we had in March, and I find I should like to continue it, if you are willing. I should also like to say, plainly, that my reasons for wishing to continue it are not entirely in the spirit of intellectual discourse. I am not certain this letter should be sent. I am sending it anyway." Clara read it twice. Then she put it in the tin box beneath her new kitchen floor, where the deed also lived, and pressed the lid closed, and stood up, and went back to her work. But she smiled, very slightly, once, facing the herb shelves where no one could see. The third moment was the evening he came to the garden gate, not on a working visit, not with Henry, not with any reasonable excuse, simply there, at the gate, at 6 in the evening in a coat that was too good for gardening and not good enough for dinner, looking, for the first time in Clara's acquaintance with him, genuinely uncertain. "I would like," he said, carefully, "to ask whether I might call on you. Properly. With your permission and in the proper manner, if you're willing." Clara set down the pot she was carrying and looked at him. "You burned my house down," she said. "I am aware. You allowed a corrupt steward to manipulate you into destroying the home of the woman who saved your son. Also accurate. And you are now standing at my garden gate asking permission to court me." "I am." Clara regarded him for a moment longer. The evening was warm, and the lavender along the path had begun to put out its first pale buds, and something about all of it, the warmth, and the smell, and the absurdity of a duke at a garden gate with his hat in his hand, was simply too much and not enough at the same time. "You may call," she said. "On Thursdays. And you will bring Henry, because he makes better conversation than you do." "That is entirely fair," Edmund said. "And you will come to the front door like a reasonable person and not stand at the gate looking worried at the lavender." "Yes." "And if you are ever again inclined to take the word of a steward over the evidence of your own common sense, I would encourage you to consult me first, because I charge a very reasonable fee for second opinions." He looked at her. And the smile that found his face arrived slowly, the way honest things tend to arrive, without announcement. "Thursday," he said. "Thursday," she agreed. He walked back to the lane. He did not look back. This time, the not looking back meant something completely different. And there, noble viewers, before we reach the final words of this tale, I must pause to thank you, truly, for staying with Clara through every page of this, for sitting with her in the dark, for watching her hold the portrait, for believing, perhaps alongside her, that truth finds its way home eventually, even if the route is longer and more painful than it should be. If this story stirred something in you, a little fire, a little feeling, a little outrage, and perhaps a little warmth by the end, then I ask this: subscribe to Forbidden Palace, leave a like upon this video, and tell us in the comments, would you have forgiven the Duke? Or would you have left him standing at the gate for considerably longer? There is no wrong answer. Only your answer. Every comment you leave, every subscription you give, every like you press, it reaches us. It says, tell us another story. And we intend to keep telling them. Subscribe to see how this unfolds and comment where you are watching from. I will love to say hello to you, just to know how far our story is going. Thank you. From this palace of stories, to wherever in the world you are reading from tonight. Ashbourne learned, as all proud houses must eventually learn, that a name above a door does not constitute the whole of a man's character, and that the measure of a person has less to do with what they command than with what they choose to correct. Oswin Vale lost his position, his freedom, and the standing he had spent 19 years building from borrowed loyalty and rearranged truth. He made restitution until restitution was all he had left to make. He was not, in the end, a villain of the theatrical variety. He was something more ordinary and more dangerous, a careful man with small appetites who had discovered that the difference between legality and justice was a gap he could use, and had used it, and had never imagined anyone would find the letter in the frame. Lady Honoria found Bath perfectly adequate. She married a baronet 2 years later. She was not unkind to him. But she was never again careless with someone else's reputation, because she had learned, at considerable personal cost, that the village remembers, and that the county talks. Henry Rycroft learned to speak in full sentences. He never stopped calling Clara by the name he had given her, even after he had the vocabulary for anything else. When asked, much later in his life, what he remembered of his very earliest years, he described a woman with copper hair and a garden full of lavender, and said she had always smelled of rosemary and been exceedingly calm about things that frightened everyone else. Edmund became, over time, a different version of himself. Not entirely new, the jaw and the decisiveness and the tendency to stand very straight under pressure remained. But opened, somehow, in the manner of a house where windows have been unstuck after long disuse. He asked more questions. He listened for the fourth question he had not thought to ask. He did not always get it right, but he asked, and that made a material difference. And Clara Whitcombe, who had once knelt in the ashes of her grandmother's home with nothing but a portrait and the very uncomfortable knowledge of a secret she had not been asked to keep, Clara rebuilt. Not only the cottage. Not only the dispensary, though the dispensary became, within 2 years, the thing she was proudest of. The place where difficult mornings became more manageable, where women who had nowhere safe to go found somewhere, where the village's children arrived, and thrived, and went home to parents who slept a little better for knowing. She rebuilt the things that the fire had been designed to destroy, her reputation, her standing, and her absolute confidence in the value of what she did. She did not rush love. She permitted it to arrive at its own pace, which was the pace of two people who had been introduced through fire and were therefore extremely cautious about heat. It arrived, eventually. Gently, as she had hoped. Not as a rescue. Not as a reward. Simply as two people, in a lavender-scented garden, on a Thursday evening, choosing each other. The village called it the finest ending to the worst beginning they had ever witnessed. Mabel Trent said she had seen it coming from the moment he came to her shop on foot with his hat in his hands. Old Percy at the farrier's said he had also seen it coming, and that he required no credit for this whatsoever, though he was very pleased to accept a slice of the cake that Mabel made for the occasion. And happiness, when it came for Clara, did not arrive as a miracle descended from above. It arrived as justice. Tended carefully, planted in good soil, given time and honest light. And this time, it stayed. What this story teaches. 1. Power without truth becomes cruelty. Edmund had position, wealth, and men to carry out his orders. But without honest information, all of that power served injustice rather than justice. The lesson is not that power is wrong. The lesson is that power exercised without the diligence to seek full truth causes harm even when harm is not intended. 2. Silence is not the same as safety. Clara kept the secret of Henry's birth out of respect for Beatrice's wishes, and that silence cost her everything she owned. Discretion is a virtue. But there are moments when the right person needs the right truth, and choosing when to speak is one of the most difficult and important decisions a person makes. 3. Grief does not excuse injustice. Edmund's loss was real and his pain was real. But pain, however genuine, does not remove a person's responsibility for how they act within it. We cannot control what happens to us. We can choose how we move through its aftermath. 4. The records matter. Foss's letter, Agnes's ledgers, the county survey. This story turns on written records. The boundary fraud persisted for 22 years because no one looked closely at the documentation. In real life, land disputes, inheritance questions, medical records, and legal contracts are decided by precisely this kind of document. Keep your records. Read what you sign. Verify what you are told. 5. Corruption thrives in trust. Oswin Vale was effective because Edmund trusted him and did not ask the fourth question. The most dangerous people in a system of authority are not those who shout, but those who are relied upon absolutely and never examined. Healthy institutions and healthy relationships require accountability at every level, including from those we trust most. 6. A person's worth is not their title. Clara had no title, no wealth, no political standing. She had skill, knowledge, honesty, and the courage to refuse when refusal was the right response. The story asks its audience to consider how often we dismiss or underestimate people based on station, and what that costs both them and us. 7. Real love begins with accountability. Edmund did not win Clara's affection by being charming or by being the Duke. He earned the beginning of it by showing up, doing the work, asking the right questions, and accepting that some things cannot be undone, only replaced by better ones. Love built on acknowledgement of wrong and the effort to make it right is more stable than love built on performance. 8. Midwives and healers have always mattered. Clara's work was unglamorous, underpaid, and largely invisible to the powerful world around her. And yet she saved the heir of one of the county's greatest houses on the worst night of the year, in a broken carriage, with only a lantern and her knowledge. The story is, in part, a recognition of the skilled women who provided medical care throughout history in roles that were rarely recorded, rarely compensated fairly, and rarely acknowledged. They mattered. They still do.